Hello, so this is week 17. This is the penultimate week in the course, Linguistics, Introduction to Linguistics. We have gone from the most minute kind of ways of measuring and looking at language to looking at language and power and hegemony and critical discourse analysis. And after looking at language families and historical linguistics, I wanted to keep things relevant by, I like to keep things relevant by looking at indigenous languages, and language endangerment, which really kind of integrates a lot of different things. For this, there really are there only are two things you really need to turn in. There will be the discussion board for California Genocide and Tachi Yokut. And these are both videos. One is almost an hour long. You can speed it up. Whatever. Take creative notes, but make sure you get the gist of it, because unfortunately too few people know the history of California Genocide. And you can't really talk about the loss of languages unless you talk about California Genocide, right? It's a good documentary with interviews from indigenous people. The narrator is Lakota, but he interviews, because this is focused on California, he does interview a lot of California Indians, indigenous peoples, and Native American Holocaust to exterminate them.
Hello. My name is Floyd Red Crow Westerman. I'm of the Dakota Sioux Nation. It is my honor to present segments from the first installment of an important new docu-series called America's War on Indian Nations. What happened to the indigenous peoples of this country is much like the Jewish Holocaust. Only America's ethnic cleansing was at the hands of people who would later claim innocence in the name of God, freedom, and democracy. Historians have been reluctant to use the word Holocaust to describe the taking of the land and the shaping of America. Instead, they use rhetoric like the new frontier, or claim that the Indians were savage after all, or...
So here, I have a little bit of a starting, like a point of departure. So one of the things he does in this is really important, and he's not the only one, but it should be known there are certain types of parts in the history you have to cover when you look at indigenous genocide. I gave a kind of book list in the assignment where it goes over kind of a whole bunch of different things, some general books that are really good, and then a whole bunch of other books, like moving through the time periods, and then very specific books on specific things. And I want to pick this up because there's a couple of things I want you to understand. When he says savages, I want you to understand, like, this goes to the core when we're looking at critical discourse analysis. How are certain people represented? And are they humanized or dehumanized? And what power does that language have? And the dehumanization of many peoples is extremely important to linguistics. It's extremely important to understanding history. It's extremely important for a lot of things. One of the things I want you to understand is that whether it was Columbus, right? So I do put books like almost the other seat of Muhammad. Here it is. Lies My Teacher Told Me, What Your American History Textbook Got Wrong, which has a whole chapter. I mean, it kind of starts about that, like one of the misrepresentations of Columbus as a heroic figure, as the first, all these different things, versus the bringer of genocide for indigenous people. And I would highly recommend James Lowen's book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, Everything Your American History Textbook Got Wrong. It is one of the classic study in this. Now they have a graphic novel version, which is really nice. But 1493, The True Importance of Christopher Columbus, The Truth About the First Thanksgiving. These are just really amazing, kind of important. Anyway. Likewise, Howard Zinn, His People's History of the United States. Those are kind of introductory overall books that are really excellent. And he starts the Columbus, Indians, and human progress. But he looks at, his whole thing is looking at marginalized history and the history we don't tell. And one of the things I really feel I need to explain is that when you look at American, and I put some books here for it. When you look at American discourse, language about indigenous people, that, so you can go back. This is a good book, Pagans in the Promised Land by indigenous lawyer, Stephen Newcomb. Decoding the Doctrine of Christian Discovery, which goes from the Catholic Church and saying, hey, Christians discovered this, so it's theirs, right? And, indigenous erasure. But, and that's a larger, throughout the Americas, and then, overall, if you look at colonizing the world, that's a giant thing. There also are kind of basic, essential, and U.S. American kind of things that a lot of people don't know. So this is 13 Clocks. How Race United the Colonies and Made the Declaration of Independence by Robert Parkinson, who's a specialist. He's a historian specializing in American Revolutionary War. And in it, he basically proves how racism, fear of black and native peoples was a driving force of the American Revolution. I mean, he has another book, The Common Cause, which is like one of the authoritative historical texts on the American Revolution. And after writing that, he felt he needed to write a book just on this. And it's excellent. So I don't know. I've taught the Declaration of Independence. I think what I want people to know is that if you read the Declaration of Independence, it starts with all these, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are inherited equal, that all men are created equal, they're endowed by their Creator with certain inherent and inalienable rights. Among them, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. We have to memorize the preamble or whatever. But that didn't matter to the people at the time. What mattered was the grievances. Okay, so the 27th, the ultimate grievance that they had against King George, had two parts. And one was, he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us. And what that refers to is slave revolts. Domestic insurrections are rebellions or revolts by enslaved Africans and their descendants. And there were a lot of them. And so he's trying to blame that on King George. And a lot of people did run over to the British because there could be a lot of enslaved people did run to get free. That's in the Star-Spangled Banner by the slave-owning anti-abolitionist Francis Scott Key. The second stanza, if you read it, the hiring and slave will go to their grave, something like that. Still does a Star-Spangled Banner yet wave, all this stuff. It's because the British said, hey, you know what? In the War of 1812, if you leave, we'll free you, right? Usually, if you're listening to that song and singing it, you read the rest of the song, and you'll see you're cheering for the wrong side, unless you are pro-slavery, you know. But the second one is, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Now, that's really typifies European colonizers' ways of warfare. But this is in the Declaration of Independence, and I think a lot of people don't know that that's there. So Dr. Bernard Navarro is a local indigenous scholar. He's Ute, of Ute descent. Teaches at Fresno City College. He has a channel. Dr. B teaches sociology. A lot of really great reels and clips, but he's a local scholar, an indigenous scholar. And I'm going to let this kind of play, because I think you should hear indigenous voices about some of these things.
Did you know the most common stereotype regarding Native Americans is that we were savages? Even in the Declaration of Independence, we are described as savages. That's right. Thomas Jefferson describes Native Americans as merciless Indian savages. It's in the Declaration of Independence. These stereotypes that colonizers used against us have a very important purpose. They are meant to rob us of our humanity so that colonizers can rob us of our land. But you know what? I'm a proud savage. Peace.
So, his YouTube channel and stuff is really excellent. Breaks down a lot of different things. I do want to... So there was a whole process in colonization. I want to show one other kind of reel here.
Someday.
This is...
somebody will.
What they did to get rid of languages was, put indigenous people in... The children. Took their children away from them and put them in government schools. Catholic run, Protestant run, whatever, government run. And they would forbid people from speaking their indigenous language. I mean, these languages didn't just passively go extinct. They were made to go extinct. They were violently made to go extinct. And so, if you haven't heard this, I mean, you should,
Hear me. My name is Andrew Windy Boy. I'm a Chippewa Cree. I did 2 boarding schools, one in Wapton Indian School in Wapton, North Dakota.
I don't know. I apologize.
Flandreau Indian School in Flandreau, South Dakota. Mid-60s to early 70s. Took me to the boarding school where I wasn't allowed to talk my native tongue or practice my native ways. They took me away from all of that and judged me for talking that. It was my first language. I didn't know any other language. So whenever I talk, it came out. Cree would come out, and whenever I talk, I get hit. I got the hits so much I lost my tongue. I lost my native tongue. The only thing I remember was my Indian name, which is Xenukihu, means old man eagle. That's the only Cree I knew. Someday somebody will hear me. My name is Andrew Windy Boy. I'm a Chippewa Cree.
So, I wanted to make sure, I want to expose people to this. The other one here is on the Tachiyot. So the other video, please, a couple paragraphs. There's a lot of details about the quote-unquote founding fathers here. Let me just...
Reservations. The ethnic cleansing was effective. Shooters break in and shoot your parents, take your children, burn your house, the children to be later used as servants and sex slaves. And if you survive that, to be rounded up like cattle and put on death marches to remote locations far from your homeland and put on reservations. A nicer term for what they really were, concentration camps. This horrific scenario is what happened to thousands and thousands, if not millions, of Indian people. For my ancestors, the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, this policy of concentration camp lifestyle was in effect from 1890 to 1930. For 40 years, my people were prohibited by law from leaving the reservations. The ethnic cleansing was effective. It is estimated that when Columbus arrived, there were approximately 20 million Indians in America. By the end of World War II, only 500,000 remained.
Okay, 1 second. Okay, so I had a little break in the recording, and I apologize. It cut me off.
As for, and I quote, California, Peterborough, urged United States troops, and I quote, listen to the words of some of the founding fathers of this country. George Washington, revered as the father of this country, wrote, and I quote, Indians were wolves and beasts who deserved nothing from the whites but total ruin. Thomas Jefferson, acclaimed proponent of freedom and democracy, argued that the United States government was obliged, and I quote, to pursue Indians to extermination or to drive them to new seats beyond our reach. Andrew Jackson, founder of the modern Democratic Party and the greatest Indian killer of all American presidents, urged United States troops, and I quote, to rout out from their dens and kill Indian women and their whelps. It is a great irony that American Indians, after being denied for many years their right to practice their own religion, speak their own languages, after being forced to live in the oppressive concentration camp lifestyles, after all that, Indians have gone on to become staunch defenders of this country in times of need. Exterminate them, the California story. In 1851, the first governor of California, Peter Burnett, wrote in a subsequent inaugural speech that a war of extermination will be waged between the two races until the Indian race becomes extinct. And in 1850, the first legislature of California enacted a law under the guise of protecting Indians, titled Subsequent Inaugural Speech, that a...
So this is the first governor of California, Peter Burnett. And what does he do? what are the first couple of things he does? Okay, to understand something, the California missions, there were, when the California, in 1769, Frau Junipero Serra, when the Jesuits came and they made their missions in California, which was part of Spain at the time, right? Mexico was part of Spain. They created those missions, and there were 300,000 indigenous people. And the Spaniards used slavery, extensive slavery. By the time that the missions had been shut down, half of the population of indigenous people in California were dead. They worked them to death. It's a horrible. It's really important to look at. It was not a good thing. It's not a romantic thing when you go to the missions. Those are concentration camps. And but the Anglos, when they came in 48, Sutter's Mill and all that stuff with the gold rush, 49ers, right? Their genocide was, it was a deliberate genocide, and extremely violent. And the first governor of California calls for the extermination of the inferior race, the Indian race. And right after that, like the first act they get passed is one which allows for the enslavement of Indians again. So by 1848, you only have 150,000 indigenous people in California, while you had 350,000 in 1769. And within 30 years, because of this extermination policy, like genocide as a word is not coined until 1944. It's a neologism that the Polish Jewish jurist Raphael Lemking makes up, taking a Greek and a Latin root and joining them together to try and describe what's happening in with the Holocaust, with the extermination of Jews and Slavs and Romani people and anybody that Hitler hated. So anyway, there's a lot of important stuff in here, and it'll break down California history and overall the genocide really well. The estimate is that there were in the U.S. There were 200. There were 10 to 20 million indigenous people in what's now the U.S. And by 1900, after all the wars of rounding them up and putting indigenous people on prisoner of war camps, which are reservations, language is really important here, there were only 250,000 left. He mentions 500,000 but basically after World War II, 1946, whatever. But it's really small, and there was a deliberate campaign of genocide. Benjamin Madley's An American Genocide is one of the books that I recommend, and I will have a few test questions on these kind of issues. A couple, just two. Anyway. So I want you to know, and it will be on the test, and it'll be an easy one.
We are Tutsi, the Mudhen people. The spirit of our people is of courage, of creativity, of fortitude. We have withstood the long, dark times of invasion.
So, overall, California, you go from 300,000 before the Spanish mission system, forced enslavement, and you go to 150,000 in 48. The Central Valley wasn't much touched. The Yokut of the Central Valley, they weren't touched until the Anglos came, until this became part of Anglo-America. And they went, the Yokut went from 70,000 within 30 years to 600. The population by 1880 or so in general went from 150,000 in 1848 to 16,000 by 1880. And in the Central Valley, the population went from 70,000 to 600. And I feel there is an obligation to teach that once I've learned it. And this will cover how that happened. And it's very important. And the importance is both, like in the other video, he says it's important to heal that you understand the wound. And I think that's really important. So I have these two videos because I feel that, this is what linguistics is supposed to do. It's supposed to help you to understand and be empathetic with people and languages and make you care about preserving things that should be preserved. So there are, on your final, and the other part of this is like, you have a final review that I want you to do. One of them is, this is an article, so it's not like I'm sorry. It's not you can find the answer if you need to. See. This is the book, American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe. I put a link there. There's an article as well. And it's just telling you, like, he uses the 1948 UN Convention on Genocide as a basis for his 700-page book, well recited. So, it was the clearest case of genocide in the history of the American frontier. Now, historian John Faragher, if you ever want to read just a really good California history, John Faragher's California history is really good. It's really engaging, and it's really good on justice and rights, but it's also just a great book of California history. I have a whole bunch of books. So, yeah, this is Genocide, the Tachi Yokut. I do have a question, which will, how many Yokut were left after in California after the white settler colonial genocide? And the answer is 600. So, no surprises. I'm not trying to surprise anybody. So, you have those two videos to go over, right? Then after the two videos, the other thing I need you to do is to watch these videos Now you only have to watch 2 for the assignment, and then you can get like 30 points for that. But if you watch more, like the first one, she's not Indigenous, but it gives a really good breakdown of Indigenous languages and where they're at and stuff like that. But these other videos center Indigenous people talking about endangered languages. I do want you to hold on. So, where I left off. So, one thing I'd like to show you is, and I'm sorry this is 30 minutes, but I do want you to know how rich California was as far as cultural heritage. We don't know when indigenous people were first here. 12,000, 14,000. There's a site in California that dates back archaeologically to 94,000. This is a little bit outdated. But before white contact, California had more linguistic variety than all of Europe. Okay, this is state of California. This is actually true. You can look it up. Today's California Indians languages are indeed the ultimate crisis of a life and death struggle, writes linguist Leon Hinton. We may see 90% of these languages, or perhaps all of them, disappear in our lifetimes. And she's writing that 30 years ago. So here are kind of some of a map of the languages. Right, you can see the Yokut here in the valley, Miwok, Ohlone, etc., etc. And this quote is from Flutes of Fire, Indigenous Essays. This book right here, Flutes of Fire, and Indigenous Essays on California. Indian. So there's 3 little things, 3 links here, right? Here, I'm going to read some of this because it's just heavy to you. I'm going to read it to you because it's heavy. At present, 96 indigenous languages. This is from the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. At present, 96% of the world's approximately 6,700 languages are spoken by only 3% of the world's population. Although indigenous peoples make up less than 6% of the global population, they speak more than 4,000 of the world's languages. Conservative estimates suggest that more than half the world's languages will become extinct by 2100. Other calculations predict that up to 95% of the world's languages may become extinct or seriously endangered by the end of this century. The majority of the languages that are under threat are indigenous languages. It is estimated that 1 indigenous language dies every 2 weeks. Indigenous languages are not only methods of communication, but also extensive and complex systems of knowledge that have developed over millennia. They are central to the identity of indigenous people, the preservation of their cultures, worldviews, and visions, and an expression of self-determination. When indigenous languages are under threat, so too are indigenous peoples themselves. The threat is the direct consequence of colonialism and colonial practices that resulted in the decimation of indigenous peoples, their languages, and their culture. These are all parts of genocide, right? It's not just killing people, literally. It is taking away their heritage, their culture, their language, their religion, everything. Through policies of assimilation, dispossession of lands, discriminatory laws, and actions, indigenous languages in all regions face the threat of extinction. This is further exacerbated by globalization and the rise of a small number of culturally dominant languages. Increasingly, indigenous languages are no longer transmitted by parents to their children. And this goes over both the language rights of indigenous people, according to international law, and that nation states are supposed to provide for education in indigenous languages, not just rob them and make them illegal, which some states still do. And they talk about language revitalization. They talk about Hawaii, but other places, and then other places where, well, there's all kinds of skullduggery that goes on with it. Now, this link basically gives you a list of all the endangered languages in the world and how endangered they are, from vulnerable to extinct, right? If you're interested in checking that out. And then the last thing, It took me a really long time. I guess I'm crazy, but these first 3 books are by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, she's part of the American Indian movement. She was their historian. She's an indigenous historian. She wrote An Indigenous People's History of the United States. Excellent book. She also wrote All the Real Indians Died Off and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans. By the way, Aviva Chomsky has a great book called They Take Our Jobs and 20 Other Myths About Immigration that I use in my critical thinking classes that I highly encourage people to read. Get and read, because it just destroys all those anti-immigration, anti-immigrant arguments. Dehumanization of immigrants, like they don't pay taxes, they do, that they commit more crime, they don't actually at all, and all these other kind of things. Not a Nation of Immigrants. Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Really, really great book. Excellent book. When you get to Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, this is kind of a classic. Not an indigenous author, but it was written like 1970, and it told the story. It tried to tell the story from a Native perspective. I've taught the book many, many times. High school, college, love it. It's not perfect, very, very good. It is a classic. It's one that a lot of indigenous activists read. This is one by an indigenous activist, kind of looking at the same history, including the history of the book. David Truer, The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, Native America, 1890 to the present. Okay, so the Revolutionary War kind of stuff. I mean, coming to the Americas, pagans in the Promised Land, decoding the doctrine of Christian discovery by an indigenous lawyer, which we need a lot of those. 13 Clocks, right? How Race United the Colonies, made the Declaration of Independence. Excellent study. Merciless Indian Savages, man. One of my favorite historians, black historians, but historians in general, is Gerald Horne. The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, and Capitalism in 17th Century North America and the Caribbean. He also wrote a book called The Counter-Revolution of 1776, looking at the American Revolution from the point of view of enslaved peoples, and saying that a lot of the revolution was actually, they were afraid that slavery would be abolished, so they had a counter-revolution to make sure that they could keep slavery in the Americas. Lies My Teacher Told Me and A People's History of the United States. Those are excellent books that deal with the histories of marginalized people. California Indigenous History, I think that Benjamin Madley's American Genocide is the book that everybody should have. This book is amazing. California Slave State by Jean Felser. This book blew my mind, and I've been reading this stuff forever. But it goes basically from, all the invaders, how they enslaved indigenous people, and how important that was. There's another book called The Other Slavery, just about indigenous slavery, which people unfortunately don't talk about here. But this has the whole continuity of it. From that, this is where I learned that, John Sutter of Sutter's Mill had a harem of 25 women, indigenous women and girls he kept enslaved, and how important the indigenous, human trafficking was in California, and still is. And it goes up to, marginalized, and it's a hard read. I mean, it covers, Asian history, other histories that you don't always get. Great book, The Making of Asian America, if you ever have time to read it. This is a classic, Murder State, California. A Cross of Thorns, The Enslavement of California Indians by the Spanish Missions. There's a lot of books on this. They are worth reading. I went when I was in the 90s and studying at Fresno State, and I learned from historians who were digging up the sites and looking at them what was really going on there, and it was pretty shocking. We Are the Land, good book. A History of Native America, California. This is interesting too, because you should look at the Scandal of Cal, and it's basically talking about, UC Berkeley was the first land grabs, white supremacy, and miseducation at UC Berkeley. Like how the California education system was based on, well, they're land grant universities, and so they stole the land from indigenous people and then profited from that, and they continue to. And basically, there are something like 15,000 indigenous human remains at UC Berkeley, and millions of indigenous artifacts. And a lot of indigenous people are trying to get their relatives' remains back because they were taken from their graves, their sacred sites. They do all their diversity stuff, and then, what are they really doing? I showed you Flutes of Fire. That is a really important book. 500 Years of Indigenous History. This is an indigenous comic book artist, and he tells the history of 500 years. It's so good. This is so good. And there's older versions that are really good, too. All the America's indigenous history. I made, for my students, like 80 questions of these. Based on this, and when they take my English class, so they have to answer those questions. There is also, they did an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States from Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, and they have Lies My Teacher Told Me. There are just so many. Finally, there's a guy named Mark Arax. Where is he going? Oh. The Dreamt Land, Chasing Water and Dust Across California. He is from Fresno, one of the greatest living writers, nonfiction writers. He does cover indigenous history, but all kinds of history of marginalized people. And I am sorry that part is so long, but I really had so much I wanted to say. The other two things, there is an extra credit. The extra credit is to, so you watch those, and then there's, the thing you need to know, really you need to study for the final, right? You have, extra credit, video and Yokat history. It's only 4 minutes, and 10 notes, and it's just, really this is the one that drives home. They get the number of how many Yokat there were wrong. They say like 20,000 when there were 70,000 or more, according to every source that I've read and listened to. But they talk about how there were only 600 left after the genocide by like 1876. This review is comprehensive. You have two things. It has everything on it. You can do the final several times. Okay, it has everything on it except for two things. So it's 50 minutes, so I'm sorry for how much you're going to have to listen to me. But it gives you all the answers, and it has a textual thing. And I think, go over... You can... I go over the Kahoot, because I can't do it in class. And I go over the test, every question. So, watch that, man. I don't believe it's cheating, I believe it's learning. There is cheating, but I don't believe that's cheating. So use the Kahoot, review for the final. It opens, should open like, midnight, Saturday. Like Saturday, if you're up at midnight still, you can start taking it. I wouldn't, but I'm going to give you Friday and then it's open Saturday. Okay, so that's really long. I'm sorry about the length, but, I hope you learned a lot. Your essay will be to write about what you learned, giving tangible examples, right, of what you learned about linguistics this semester. And, here's to your learning journey, man. There's oceans and oceans and oceans of knowledge you can acquire, and a whole sense of wonder you can reacquire through studying linguistics. Thank you for being part of this journey. I am sorry if I ramble too much, but I hope this is helpful. Okay. I'm really sorry it's like almost 2 hours of videos this week. But And if I actually re-recorded 20, I had 20 minutes. This I lost. So, anyway, take care.